All right. Now let's talk about a company that the market thinks has really tough issues that's going to get hard for it to get out of, but maybe the market has overblown its concerns. So Qualcomm has been in the news because even though positive trends have been around smartphones, Qualcomm stock has a weight on it, which is a weight that is in the shape of a giant apple. So Apple has been Qualcomm's biggest customer for forever. Right? They have to pay them licenses for being able to use the technology that Qualcomm has. They buy modems from them to make sure that iPhones work correctly and iPads and Apple Watches and everything else. To the tune of, for a company with $41 billion of revenue, Apple is about $10 billion of it was what it was, if memory serves me correctly in terms of what the number is. So, and Qualcomm has basically said, hey, look, Apple is going to stop buying from us by 2027. By 2027, our Apple revenue is likely to be this. Right, a 25% drop in the stock. And so that, and Joel, a couple other things have really actually sent analysts panicking, right?
Well, I think, the issues are, even though people know that, look, if Apple's going to spend $500 billion, which they can't possibly, but if they're going to spend a huge amount of money building plants, they got to make stuff. And what they're saying is we're going to start making the things that we used to buy from our vendors. So we don't have to buy your Snapdragon super Qualcomm, wireless technology kind of thing. We're going to make it ourselves. So, but everybody knows this, right? Everyone knows this. So the thing is, what's happening is that Qualcomm is still selling more, but people are concerned because the smartphone in general market is kind of saturated, right? Everyone already has 2 or 3 or 4 cell phones, and around the world, even the poorest communities, right? It's interesting. I see this in Southeast Asia all the time. People get paid, right? And they spend it on their telecom, then they buy food. I'm not joking, right? It's like I'm going to pay for my phone so I can stay connected to my friends and family because I'm super poor, and then whatever I have left, I'll spend on groceries. That's not an exaggeration. So at that point, you'd say, the market's kind of been saturated at this point, and so people are concerned that maybe the smartphone market's saturated.
And I think that, in that context, right, because that's the other noise, Joel, and I think that you got a great story about, somebody who we've listened to say thoughtful things about how Wall Street works because he is a well-respected Wall Street analyst who's kind of highlighted some of the other concerns out there, right?
So in this space, Tal Liani, who's at Bank of America, who's arguably the true number one analyst covering these stocks and been covering Qualcomm for years. I asked him to come in and speak at one of my MBA programs, live and in person, not virtual. And he actually physically came in. It was wonderful, and he spoke. And of course, the student said at the time, I think he had like a 49% track record of picking stocks, meaning he was dead on 50.
Getting his recommendations were right. Yeah, exactly.
And he was the first to say, listen, nobody pays me to be a stock picker. Being a stock picker is my client's job, meaning all the investors that pay attention to him. He said, my job is to be the world's number one industry analyst about this company. And, I'm required. He even said I'm required by law, by the SEC, that I have to put a target price and I have to put a buy-sell recommendation. I actually added the comment that of all the analysts I've spoken with when he was presenting in my class, I said I can't tell you how many analysts wish they didn't have to. They just want to be industry analysts and industry experts. So he's great. He focused on an important question. He was on the last earnings call that Qualcomm did, and he was the cleanup. I think he kind of waited until the last question, and it was a doozy. He said, "Look, the smartphone market is flat, but you guys are still posting growth." And he said, "What's the longevity of this? Like, how long can you keep selling more chips, more Qualcomm chips, when at the same time the smartphone market is flattening out?" And he actually specifically said, "I think you're getting a lot of growth from China, and how long is that going to possibly last?" Right? I mean, really tough questions, and I think that's what's creating the overhang in the stock. With his questions, fantastic. Again, we would never care about Taliani's stock price recommendation or target price or whatever else. Nobody would, and he knows that. He admitted that. He said, but his industry analysis and the questions that he asks are dead on accurate to what you want to hear.
And to your point, right, what he's zeroing in on is he's actually basically saying, hey, the Apple story is known out there, but you guys are still posting growth because of China. I think that China is going to run out. And if you look at what embedded expectations are, which is that idea that we talked about for Qualcomm, if we step back and we look at Qualcomm, we look through how performance has been, what analysts forecast it's going to be, and then what the market's pricing in. Right, Qualcomm had a couple good years from 2020 to 2021, 2022, where ROA, return on assets, how we look at the total profitability of a business, shot up like a rocket ship. And 23 and 24, things have kind of stagnated. Well, Wall Street analysts, like Tal, right, are basically saying, hey, you're going to have some improvement from those low levels in 25 and 26, but it's not going to be a ton. And the really interesting thing, though, is the market, right, is basically saying, we know Apple's coming, though, and we also know what Tal is picking up on, that the China growth could run out. And so the market's already pricing return on assets for Qualcomm to roll over pretty significantly and to drop. And this is where the interesting pivot comes, right, Joel, is because everybody's already talking about this idea of, the concern with China. I think you had a really good, soundbite from the actual earnings call in terms of how Qualcomm management probably even knows about the concern in China, right?
Yeah, I mean, so Taliani said, can you give me a bit of a China update? And then they proceeded to answer questions and did not answer his question. And then he asked again. This is, by the way, this is the last part. If you can, go on YouTube, whatever. So it's the last part of the earnings call, this hour and a half or whatever else. In the last 5 minutes, he's hitting these hard-hitting questions like, the market of smartphones is flat. You're still growing. How long before you flatten? That's basically what he's asking. And he said, because it seems like you're getting a lot of growth from China. Now, I don't know if anyone knows, but China is in massive deflation, and that's not because of currency mismanagement. They're in massive deflation because supply is outpacing demand, and not just in China, but they're also having a supply issue in terms of overproduction to who China is selling to. Right, and these are Chinese smartphones that are being sold, and even that is experiencing export price deflation. And so he's basically saying, look, at some point, the producers are overproducing. You're selling to the producers. What happens when those producers say, okay, we're going to pull back? Will that not hit you? Now, what Rob and I think is that's already priced in, that this is already being priced in, that the market is not seeing 15, 20% growth that management's communicating. But, oh, by the way, Rob, they then did not answer, and a third time, 3 separate times, Taliani had to say, hey, what about China? And then he said, what about China? And then he asked again, what about China? And finally, the management at Qualcomm said, well, but we also expect there's going to be some subsidies. I was like, so at the very last word of the call, when he's like avoiding the question on China, he still said, but we're hoping that China will subsidize production,
right,
meaning
smartphones and everything else.
We'll pay for smartphones to be made that people aren't buying, so that they'll still keep buying more Snapdragons and more Qualcomm chips. So that is an overhang, but we think that's priced in, and that's, Rob, what your point is.
And so what's interesting, everybody, is right is that's what's priced in, right? When we look at these white bars, the white bars are what the market expects, and the market's already expecting returns to fall off because of the quote unquote equivalent of a patent cliff, if you will, of losing Apple, of a big drop in revenue like a biotech would get, that we're going to see a similar thing that the market's already pricing in here. But what we think the market might be missing, and this might be a catalyst sometime down the road, is when you talk to really smart people in the AI space, like Professor John Sfiocco, who's a friend of Altimetry and owns his own AI consulting firm, deep thinker in terms of the world of generative AI and everything else. What he'll tell you is, in the next few years, inference using ChatGPT or anything else to engage as a consumer is going to happen on the phone. And that's going to mean a lot more demand for complex chips that Qualcomm makes that ended up on the phone. And so when we look at that, we look and we say, you know what, this is clearly something that the market is already negative on the name. That doesn't mean you should buy it now if AI could pick up in the future, but it means at some point Qualcomm is going to pick up. By the way, not dissimilar to how Qualcomm was a straight rocket ship in 1998, 1999, and 2000 in the final part of the dot-com boom.